I'm going to get out of the way and turn things over to Ms. Faue, who's got a presentation for us.
Just a few words of preface. Peter, when he asked me to do this, and Robin as well, are asking me to revisit something that I wrote a long time ago. And while it certainly shows up in the more recent book, revisiting that terrain has been really interesting. I believe that one goes through material at a certain point in one's life and reads it in one way, and then as we mature, have experiences ourselves, we rethink and reshape things. So tonight there might be a few hesitations and a few slides I'm going to really go right through very fast because I think I'm not quite there yet with this stuff. But it's in part because any presentation on women in labor in the years between 1920 and 1945, there's too much evidence. There are too many women to talk about. There's too much going on in those decades. And it makes it very difficult to sort of pick among different case studies. So today, earlier today, I gave a short talk as well. And I wound up spending more time on Minneapolis than I will tonight. But I think that what I'm talking about tonight, you would have seen in Minneapolis and St. Paul, you would have seen it across the country. And how I started that one was actually by talking about the two questions that I think are still kind of up for grabs in all of this. One of which is the continuing mystery of why people actually organize when they do, mobilize when they do. And how the 1930s were a decade in which it wasn't exactly promising that we would have a labor rebirth. In times of high unemployment, workers have very little leverage. And in many, many ways, it was unusual for women and men to wind up organizing in a decade in which they literally had no power at the beginning of it. They literally had no leverage in the workplace. So that's one question that I long have started out with when I teach the 30s lecture in my class. But the other question that's really shaped my career and my scholarship is why women, I guess, are either smart enough or foolish enough to continually keep knocking at the door of labor when labor over the course of it has not always been open to having women members, to being a welcoming social movement to women. And in the decade of the 30s, I think that actually does change. There are real signs of growth. It has an impact after the 30s in terms of how labor deals with women. But it again is sort of an unexpected decade, really shadowed with the language about the forgotten man and people who were just weeping for a particular part of the population, white and male, and industrial workers, that it turned out to be a good time for women to organize too. So the third thing, which I didn't raise today in an explicit way, and that because there's a leadership class as well, I was asked to think about, was about women in leadership. So the talk today is going to start out by talking a little bit about leadership, and then we're going to go into the decade of the 30s and look at some examples of women organizing, and then return to those questions of how women engage in this, how leadership comes out of it, and their experiences, and what I think is really an important movement, not just for economic gains, but for democratic power and in society, which is the labor movement. The labor movement should not ever be thought of as a movement that did not have to engage politics, and in which politics winds up as a major realm for organizing. So I was haunted when I was with this quote, which is always, is variously attributed, but actually belongs to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. The IWW has been accused of pushing women to the front. This is not true. Rather, the women have been kept back, have not been kept back, so naturally they moved to the front. And I think that again, the IWW being an industrial union movement, being a movement that had strong connections to community, winds up being one of those places where women demonstrate some of their leadership. The next one doesn't have a picture, so we can move on. Women in the labor movement, from its origins, the labor movement has had women activists and members, and I think that that should be taken as a given. As we were tossing this around earlier today, I would say it's because any social movement needs somebody who knows where the food is. And they need to know where you can get the coal. They need to know who lives down the block and who can be persuaded to join something. And women in our societies, and again, mostly for reasons of socialization, but also sort of their social location, are crucial to any social movement in a building, period, in particular, because they bring those resources, those skills, and that knowledge. And so the labor movement in its history, you would find women all along, even when they are not workers. And some of our most famous women labor leaders were actually not workers. So Elizabeth Gurley Flynn certainly worked hard at organizing and writing, but Elizabeth Gurley Flynn never held a sort of routine working class job. Lucy Parsons, who is the widow of Albert Parsons from the Haymarket incident, Lucy Parsons certainly worked in her life, but she wasn't organizing from a workplace position. She organized as a worker, other workers. And Janora Johnson, who plays a major role in the Flint sit-down strike, creating and leading the Flint Emergency Brigade, was not in the workforce. She had a wife, she was a wife, maybe she had a wife too, who knows. And she approaches it from sort of the margins, but the margins are really crucial when social movements are rebuilding. And that's one of the things that we need to understand. The labor movement is in a rebuilding period through the 20s and the 30s, and that is one of the reasons why they are able to move. And women are central to that. In the 19th and for most of the 20th century, women, even women workers, have constituted a minority of union members. It has not stopped them from being active, from organizing, from belonging, from striking, from doing strike support. They were also, for most of that period, characterized as being really good strikers but poor unionists. And there's also a sense to that I think, again, partly stems from the fact that many of them were not in the workforce at the time when they're active, but also the fact that the labor movement as an institutional entity was not always happy to take them in. So that characterization kind of is fairly good for a good part of labor history. And also, until the 1970s, women constitute less than 40% of the labor force, which puts them in a different relationship to the labor movement than men. I think we're a couple of slides before that.
I
think the one before it.
What is it called? Oh.
Poor unionists.
There you go.
Poor union. So to think about that, women workers and women family members of workers basically participated in a male-dominated labor movement during this system. The organizing culture of labor in many instances was a male culture. It met in taverns. It sometimes had
rifle clubs and made visits to brothels. The labor movement was really a guy's organization. So when women got involved, it was because the labor movement either created spaces that were not so male-defined, or that women created them for labor. Women also were oftentimes dismissed as being not serious because they worked for pin money when they did work, and that their family obligations and interrupted work histories kind of made them not appropriate targets. This is certainly the rationale that the labor movement has during most of this period. And they kind of double it up by a lot of gendered languages and values. The language of labor uses a lot of male language, male imagery. It might celebrate the motherhood as an appropriate role for women, but it didn't always see women as being solidaristic, as being leaders of the movement. And I think there's also, and this is an undercurrent to a lot of movements where men and women work together, is that the dynamics of sexuality are going to enter that movement and going to shape it. And so, you know, I think it's something that hasn't been explored very much, but could be thought about as yet another reason why the labor movement was timid about bringing in women. But nonetheless, as we've been talking about, they came anyway. One of those people is actually Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and even though she predates the period that we're talking about, I think it's interesting because she wrote a memoir. She starts to talk about how she became a rebel, really how she became a leader, and she looks at her past. I think this is a great quote. It is difficult to say just how, when, or where our rebellious spirits are born. We are but fortunate inheritors of a rich legacy. And she goes on to talk about her father's Irish nationalism and her mother, whose own vision of womanhood wasn't just wife and motherhood. It was she wanted her girls to have a life of their own, for them to be somebody. And that in some ways, the women who do emerge as leaders in a labor movement like this have to have had that kind of push from their families, or at least friends who recognize in them, who see in them someone with leadership capacity. So what makes a woman a labor leader? I think that I like to think about this in the terms that I was just talking about. Does a woman know where the food is? Does she know who in the neighborhood can be tapped? Does she know who is in the neighborhood? Who belongs to what church? What church has a room where we can meet? Where there's someone who's willing to put us up for an evening and to basically have a free space that we can bring ourselves to think about what we need to do in the workplace. And this is a crucial organizing skill that is much undervalued. It's in essence, it's a kind of grassroots analysis that we don't acknowledge that would be true of any labor organizer and leader. They need to be able to think about a problem, to break it down into pieces, to recognize what the resources are, what population can be tapped, who are the allies, what tactics might work, and what is the overall strategy. Can you see not just that your paycheck today is short, but can you see in the future what you're going to need? And is that going to be more than a paycheck? And who can be brought to that in the future as well as in the present? It's also the skills of relationship building and the capacity to both delegate authority, but also to see skills, experience, and value in others. These are true of any leader, but I think that women who become leaders of these social movements like labor have these skills in excess. They are the only way that you can rise in a movement that tells you that you don't belong, is if you bring those skills to the table. The capacity to listen, the ability to inspire, not just by charismatic speeches, but by quietly talking to someone about how they belong. Quietly mentioning that there's a place for these people, or getting them to actually consider acting against their own interest, against their own fear. These are skills that are part of the leadership package that we oftentimes don't acknowledge, but seem to be, for many women leaders, part of what they have to offer. Their pathways to leadership, especially, again, given the labor movement we're talking about in the 20s and 30s, male-dominated, up until the late 30s, dominated by skilled workers, a lot of old labor that needs to be sort of shook up. Women who are going to emerge in those leadership categories are either going to be, and I think this is important, strategically located in a crisis spot, which isn't part of the list, but also might be able to come to that leadership through a variety of ways. I wrote a book about an earlier labor journalist and organizer, and I recognized it in her, the fact that she needed mentors. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, almost all of these mentors are going to be male. Men who recognize your skills and who bring you into the circle. By the mid-20th century, there are women who are serving those roles, but those people who are mentored, and I use Millie Jeffrey as an example. Millie Jeffrey is a UAW member of long standing, led their women's department for about a decade during the war, and in the 1950s and 60s emerged as one of the primary political and community organizers for the UAW, was really attached to UAW attempts to engage in electoral politics and to get out the working class vote. I'm sure it sounds a little patronizing, but Millie Jeffrey was literally like 4'8", maybe 4'6". She's a little woman, but I have never seen anybody with that much motive power. And she was a good friend of Walter Reuther, but she had come out of a middle-class background, was a social worker, and comes to the labor movement from like way off in the wings, and takes over and winds up being one of the major routes by which other women emerged as leaders in the UAW. The path by which rank and file women became political activists through the UAW. So she's a very key figure, and I think mentorship brings her in and becomes one of the primary ways in which she engages in the labor movement. Then there are people who come from community. Addie Wyatt, who is a leader in the packing house workers, beginning in the 1940s to the 50s and 60s, was one of those people, comes out of the black community, out of a particular black church, gets engaged in civil rights politics at sort of the base level in Chicago, but becomes a major figure in the packing house workers and one of, I think, the first vice president of the packing house workers who's a woman. And I think of her as an example of somebody whose community roots are so deep and who is able to mobilize people, not just in labor's cause, but in civil rights cause, but also the reverse. Not just in civil rights causes, but in labor causes. I also think that there's a root that, again, sort of stems from my earlier research, but I think is really important, which is the women who are the boundary crossers, who emerge in movements and who never quite fit. One of the examples, the example I've given here is Ella Mae Wiggins. Does anybody know who Ella Mae Wiggins is? There's got to be at least one person in the room. Okay, Peter does, of course. During the Estonia strike in 1929, Ella Mae Wiggins emerges from, again, this sort of poor textile workers community. She's kind of a bounder, and she literally sort of had a child on wedlock. She's sleeping with the wrong guy. She loves to dance, she's probably a drinker. She kind of goes against the grain of so many like upright Southerners. And yet, she emerges in this strike as a key figure. Ella Mae Wiggins helps to organize the Gastonia Mills. And she does so despite, but also maybe because of her capacity, her will to cross boundaries. She's one of the people in Gastonia that's talking to the black workers. And in the South, being willing to cross a racial line is one of those key signifiers. And Ella Mae Wiggins, again, she dies tragically, back road, the sheriff sent out with his guys. They basically put down the strike in Gastonia and she winds up getting shot. But again, she sort of symbolizes this capacity and this way to leadership, which is by being the person willing to cross the lines, willing to violate the norms in order to bring people into a social movement. And then lastly, I talk about labor education, and one of the people that I thought about was Vicky Starr, who was also in the Packing House Workers, was interviewed in Stoughton Lynn and Alice Lynn's rank and file. And in her interview, she talks a lot, I think it's about the YWCA, but there's lots of women who are rank and file workers who are sort of hesitant, a little bit deferential at first, and they wind up in these labor education programs at the Brookwood School, the Bryn Mawr Summer School for Women Workers, the YWCA's worker programs, the Women's Trade Union League, which had labor education programs, and winds up again sort of getting as much of an education as you can get in that environment that fits you precisely within a labor movement with the kind of resources that you can bring to that. So that labor education became a way in which many women would emerge as labor leaders. Just the short course here is that the time that we're talking about is also a time in which women in the workforce, the jobs they do, the number of women there are, the kind of women they are, is really changing, and that is going to make an impact on this movement. I think we're going to skip the next one too, it'll come up later. I just want to sort of summarize this first part by talking about women's barriers to participation during this period, and then we will go through and talk a little bit about what happens in these years. These years are not just years in which women workers are confronted with the labor movement's own prejudices or barriers to their participation, but that these are decades in which there are also barriers that include hiring biases, shared cultures that really dismissed unionism, laws that prohibited certain kinds of action, and a real failure to sort of support women in the workplace, as well as, by the end of the 20s, a major economic crisis. Next slide. These are some of the women of Gastonia, 1929. So, just sort of, it's a little bit like a reboot right in the middle of the talk, but what we're going to do now is sort of talk about the period itself and how women fit into it. We've got our structure, some ideas about leadership. Now we're going to talk about this, and everybody in the room knows in 1929 the Great Depression begins. They've been preceded by some poor economic years, by stagnant wages, and also by a decade in which labor is really usually described as quiescent. I think there's some signs of activism. You've probably read that in the book if you've read the book. But it's a period of rebuilding in which labor and people who consider themselves labor allies are really working to find some solid ground from which they can move. And in this period, you saw the rebirth of lots of things that would give momentum to workers organizing in the 1930s. Some of this is that the labor press has to sort of build up from the bottom. They were destroyed in many ways during World War I due to some federal laws, due to the suppression of immigrant activists, due to deportation raids. And so the labor movement in 1919, 1920 basically doesn't have a very strong labor press. And over the course of the 20s, they rebuild in part through the efforts of the federated press and individual labor reporters. This becomes very important and lays the groundwork. There are all these labor associations, and I've mentioned some of them with regard to women. We could throw in women's auxiliaries. We could talk about some of the organizations that appear in the 1920s that will become very important to labor's rebuilding. There are lots of experimentation during the late 20s as well in organizing workers in Passaic, in Gastonia, in Harlan County. Even in Detroit, there's an effort to try to organize in an industry that simply doesn't seem to have room for industrial unions. And in all of those things, women appear in marginal but important roles that they will capitalize on during the Depression. So that when the Depression comes, you basically saw people looking at a landscape in which labor has very few resources, is shrunk its membership, and is faced with little to no leverage in the workplace. And what happens over the course of the next 3 to 4 years is that certain things will happen that lay the groundwork for labor's reemergence in 33, 34, 35, 36, 37. And also sort of create institutions that will make this mobilization become a permanent one that is going to have a long-term effect on workers and on workplaces. And again, I just want to emphasize that women are very much a part of this. And one of the reasons that I say that, and it goes back to, everybody will remember, Liz Faue said, women know where the food is. The only thing you'll remember from tonight. But in some ways, in the time, in these early years of the Depression, people are trying to find ways to fight very specific immediate problems. And while that leads to a lot of disorganization, people doing a lot of self-blame, not being able to sort of even conceive of collective action, there's also all of this low-level collective action which women turn out to be central. So the unemployed councils, especially the neighborhood councils, are one of the places where you find women in the late 20s and early 30s, and where, again, they know who's on the block, they know whose kids need food, they know where they can get it, they know which social worker to go to if you have a problem. They also know that if we get a certain number of women out here, we can stop an eviction. They're sort of almost like a safety net that at the time when it's sort of catching people is literally being woven. That each time they make a move, they're actually building an institution. They're building a movement. And women are very central to that for the reasons I described. It's also true that within that sort of forming social movement is that there's also all of these veterans of earlier movements who carry with them not just, oh, I was a member of so-and-so, but the actual knowledge on how you do these things. And they become key to the rebuilding movement. There is also an understanding that comes from earlier defeats about a very crucial part of this movement. And I mentioned this earlier today, but I think it's so crucial to bring it up here too, even though it's a sidestep to what we're talking about, which is that unions pretty early in the 30s adopt the slogan that they are really out there preaching the gospel of unity and unionism. And if you think about the devastation of these strikes in 1918, 1919, 1920, which are basically smashed up against the rocks of racism, of ethnic conflict, of communities that are falling apart under this pressure, of police forces that are literally deporting parts of these communities. Unity had to be part of this motto. This notion that, for instance, in the packing house, workers are great. Packing houses in Chicago, they tried twice in major campaigns to organize them. It doesn't get done until the 1930s when there's an explicit recognition that this is a labor force of different ethnicities, of different races, in which women are a major part of the labor force. So you had to have a union that sort of celebrated what brought people together. And unionism is just to underline that any activity had to be collective. It could not be selective and individual. So that sort of recapturing that in the early years of the 30s gives so much impetus to this movement. And there's also, and I think this is important, however you might feel about labor law, that the early 30s brings us both an anti-injunction law, and it brings us first the National Industrial Recovery Act, and later the National Labor Relations Act, both of which create frameworks within which worker activism can, again, establish itself as long-term, stable, and possibly permanent. And those laws also have not just a legitimizing effect for unionism, but again, a kind of an inspirational and aspirational effect. The line is in 1933, after the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act, the president wants you to form a union. For people who were shy, who were timid, who were deferential to authority, or who thought that trouble was the only thing that could come out of activism, the president wants you to form a union, became that kind of legitimizing and motivational slogan. So these factors in which women play a role and which will sort of guide women's activism are part of why, by 1933, there are major parts of the American labor force that start to organize unions. Some of the industries that had been organized regenerate and begin to recruit new members. I would use as an example the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the United Mine Workers, who regenerate early in the 30s. And they lead up to the big 3 strikes in 34 that are so key. And then I'm just going to put them out here. Minneapolis truckers strike, the San Francisco longshoremen strike, and the Toledo auto light strike. And in all 3 of these strikes, which are done in male-dominated workplaces and among almost exclusively male labor forces and in longshoremen and warehousemen's work and in truck driving, women turn out to be key players in strike support and leadership. And in each of these cases, you would have found women central to their rebirth. 33, there's this effort to do this. The only thing that's really important to know is that basically John Lewis helps to create the CIO. Okay, we're moving on. I'm now going to talk about the one case that I spent the most time in this, which is the case of the auto industry. And in the auto industry, again, a really interesting phenomena, because in the 1920s, there's a lot of fear that Detroit is turning into a she-town because certain auto companies started to hire women, mostly to do things like sew seats and to do really light finishing work on cars. And and also to work in this smaller, less prosperous, and less powerful auto parts plants, like Briggs is one of the ones in Detroit. And so in the 20s, this is actually put out in actually left labor journals that there's this fear that the auto industry is going that way, but it's also clear, I mean, if you know autos, that the work and the way that it was organized in the 30s would have made any kind of permanent and wholesale transformation almost impossible. But the auto industry is so key to the Detroit area and actually throughout the Midwest. And it's an industry that was literally impossible to work, even in the high point of the IWW. They just cannot crack the plants. In the 1920s, when there's actually a pretty well-organized group of skilled workers in Mesa, and I don't remember what Mesa stands for, there's just no movement. And when the Depression comes to Detroit in 1929, 1930, 1931, at the depths of unemployment, which is I think 30 and 32 before the election, Detroit unemployment is running in excess of 60%. I mean, Detroit was a single industry town, and yeah, there were some other businesses, but it is that way. And it was difficult to imagine in 1932 that there was any capacity for this city or this industry to be unionized. But again, these early union efforts through the CP, the Auto Workers Union, and through MESA, which is the Skilled Workers Organization, you begin to see some movement. And by the mid-30s, even in the most powerful and restrictive union town like Flint, Michigan, there's organizing going on. And by the end of 1936, in the midst of this company town of Flint, with a labor force where there's lots of ethnic and racial divides, where the presence of women is a little bit suspect, there's an amazing growth of organization. And the Ruther brothers are part of this, but it's grassroots stuff. It is not two people organizing an industry. And they are all over these auto plants in the Midwest. I'm not going to tell you the whole strike, but the pictures are nice. In the right corner, the baby is holding a sign that says, "Our Daddy's Strike for Us Little Tykes." One of the great pictures that actually shows up with babies and banners, a film about the Women's Emergency Brigade. But in December of '36, the auto workers go out on strike in Flint, and they do a sit-down strike. It's not the first sit-down, but it's probably the most significant sit-down. It really kicks off a whole wave of them. And men sit down in the factory. And women are at first they're all meeting in Gurley Hall, which is a community center, and it's sort of strikes central. It's the headquarters. And women are being told to cook the soup and to sort of sit back. And Jenora Johnson and other people just don't want that. What they want to do is be out and to support their men and be out on the picket line. And they're the ones who create the Women's Emergency Brigade, which will later show up in other auto towns and during other strikes. They meet at Gurley Hall in Flint at first. Again, they all did some of the kitchen work, but it quickly moves into first aid, it moves into other support activities, and finally it moves into picketing. And the women all wind up with these armbands. If you were in Flint, they were red. If you were in Detroit, they were green. And they basically charge out at various critical points of the strike and intervene on the picket line. I love the documentary with Babies and Banners, because you do get that sense of, you know, one day I get called aside, Janora Johnson tells you, and we have to be at this place, but that's just a feint, and then I was told where we really have to be. And she talks about this, and you can see again the sort of the calculation and the women they interview who all feel themselves, they're emerging as leaders. And I just, you know, again, sort of Janora Johnson winds up sort of as a banner leader, but it's got a great bench. It's all of these women who wind up on the picket line and who really are essential, wind up moving. I think it's Chevrolet, it's either Chevrolet 4 or 8, where they're directed to go, and they finally close down the last plant, and they kind of bring GM to the bargaining table at last. And what's interesting about this is the women's auxiliary of the UAW, the brigades themselves, but later their sort of institutional form as auxiliaries, last well into the 40s. The sit-down way that follows, again, encompasses some of the places where women work, including the Woolworth strikes. There's a growing wave of strikes until they're finally found illegal, but you would have found it in all kinds of places, and women being central to those sit-down strikes. I think I've already gone on too long, so I'm going to I want to skip the packing house workers. We've talked a little bit about them. And the ILGW you've got to mention. I'm just going to use as one of my last examples until I talk about the legacy of this, is the San Antonio pecan sheller strike of 1938. This comes after there's been a lot of activism, and it's something that I think, again, sort of falls off the radar of a lot of standard labor history. You won't find it in my book, but there's a woman named Emma Teneyuka, who is a member of the Communist Party, has been part of these communist labor neighborhood organizations, was basically a community organizer, and she helps to organize the pecan shelling industry in San Antonio. San Antonio has produced about 50% of the nation's pecans in 1938, 400 factories, and the women in those factories were sort of stereotypically women workers at the time, underpaid, paid less than men. Their pay is not stretching far enough. They're in abysmal conditions, including little to no toilet facilities, no breaks. And many of them are, if not migrants themselves, the children of migrants, part of this Mexican-American community, and feeling very disempowered. But over the course of this, as Teneyuka and others come in and sort of get them to finally strike at this crucial moment, they all wind up walking the picket line and winning the strike. Over 12,000 pecan shellers go on strike in 1938. And these people who felt themselves to be powerless, again, sort of brought along by grassroots leaders like Teneyuka, wind up winning the strike and being an important part of what I think of as the emerging labor democracy of the 1930s. I'm going to skip the little steel strike because I think that was supposed to actually be deleted. So what I want to talk about in the end here is not just that this decade saw the emergence of very powerful industrial unions, which, at least in rhetoric and sometimes even in practice, followed a politics of unity and of racial and gender equality, but also organized the unorganized, and brought with them this sense that labor had to have a permanent place at the table, that it was no longer to be brought in just when things were hot, like during wars, when labor was in demand, but that they needed to create a permanent place at the table. And while some things that happened at the end of the 30s signal at least a momentary disappearance of some of the women who led those strikes, by the 1940s, not just with the war, but through the decade of the 40s and 50s, the structures that they built survived, but so too did the networks that they built. And when you look at the labor movement of the 40s and 50s, when you look at who emerges as maybe the first woman member of an executive board, the first woman vice president of a union, the woman who's leading the ward organizations in different cities, who comes to speak for labor on issues of race and gender as well as workers' demands, you would have found women who were very much not just the sort of people who were trained by the movement, but even the children and heirs of this activism. So that the industrial democracy that emerged out of this, however imperfect, by the end of the 30s and into the 40s, actually created a much more visible and powerful place in American democracy for labor unions, but also for rank and file workers. It did so not just by having a democratic voice in the workplace, but also by their engagement in ward politics, in community organizing, and the kind of grassroots political innovation that is crucial to any time of democratic change. The New Deal becomes a kind of institutional expression for it, and while we spent decades beating up on it, wouldn't we like to have it back? And women, again, were very much a part of building that New Deal coalition and those institutions. The labor movement thus gets reinvigorated through working class political action and through women's own community level activism. In our books that talk about the 1930s, we don't often talk about how central women were to this effort, but they were. It is difficult to imagine the reemergence of labor in the 30s and 40s without women's activism and leadership. And while this collective sense of their power in the 30s becomes much more focused on individual women leaders in the 40s and 50s, they still left for the labor movement and for democracy a legacy of women's involvement that we see mirrored even today. Thank you. I think I can take questions. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, what do you feel the role of the activism of women helped to ensure the appointment of Frances Perkins as the Secretary of Labor under the Roosevelt administration?
Well, there are a couple of reasons why she gets appointed. I'm not sure how much grassroots support she had, but she's part of this network of labor reformers and organizers in New York that would have included people like Rose Schneiderman, but also part of the political organization within the Democratic Party, people like Molly Dewson, who were supporters of FDR, and again, whose career you can't imagine without the women behind him that really pushed his progressive policies as New York governor. And later, when Perkins becomes Secretary of Labor, what they do through that. But I don't think there's a direct line from women rank and file workers, but I think that there is, again, an infrastructure there of women who are engaged in labor activism and in labor reform that helped to make her for her appointment. Yeah.
You had said that women are seen as working for pin money. What is pin money?
It's very funny because I'm not sure that I even have a right definition of it. When I was young, I thought it literally meant money that you buy for pins. And then I thought maybe it's the money that sometimes women pin to dresses or in places where their husbands wouldn't find it. And I think that there's actually a tie to pins that were used to attach hats. But I think it's meant to diminish the significance of their wages and to not acknowledge the fact that many women, if they weren't the sole bread earner, might have been a strategic and really important bread earner in families. But it was used again as a kind of a dismissive way of, we don't have to organize them because they're only working for pin money. Their fathers or their future husbands will provide for them.
Pennies on a dollar.
Pennies on the dollar. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Peter.
So, when a bunch of us here first read your book, one of the things that struck us was that instead of the focus that many of us had had, that social movements tend to get absorbed into institutions and lose their energy and radical edge as social movements, that your book encouraged us to think about how institutions could become launching pads for social movements as collections of resources, human resources, as well as material resources. And so, given what you've presented tonight, one of the things I'd like to ask you to think a little bit more with us about is how the second wave women's movement was influenced by these developments in the labor movement. That is, what happened in the 50s and 60s in the women's movement in some ways grew out of the experiences both empowering and limiting that women had experienced in the labor movement. And I think of Betty Friedan and how few of us think of Betty Friedan as someone, who came out of the labor movement as a editor or publicist in the United Electrical Workers.
Right.
So I wonder if you'd like to run with that a little bit.
It's really interesting because most people who start to talk about the second wave women's movement want to start it in the late 50s and early 60s, and they want to look at Friedan, again, sort of taken out of context as somebody who word is, it's like a women's magazine writer that suddenly gets a hot idea. And she writes The Feministy. And I've always thought that didn't sound right to me, and especially because in her early activism, what is she really concerned about? She's concerned about women's employment equality. Of hiring or firing, wages, promotions, and there's a lot of that early movement that she works on, organizations that are precisely about trying to use social movement and organizational tactics to kind of address this fundamental problem with our democracy, that women did not have equal access to our economic system. And they didn't have equal economic rights. And even the people who will acknowledge that tend to think of it as this middle class movement that emerges, and then when women's liberation emerges, they tie that to women who are white women in colleges who come up through civil rights and the anti-war movement, and then that is the path. And having been a student of Sarah Evans, I almost had the temerity to say to her, has she ever rethought that formulation? Because I think there are parallel movements here. And in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, there's all this women's activism in places that we don't look for it, like the peace movement. And that is not just an elite women's movement. And they're there in civil rights activism, not just in Montgomery bus boycott, but stuff up north, but stuff that's about fighting for equal rights, civil rights. And a lot of the early wage cases, once you get the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act under Title VII, the creation of EEOC, a lot of that activism doesn't come out of the women's movement. It's not now. It's basically the packing house workers, the electrical workers, and the UAW, women who were leaders in those movements, and the lawyers who worked for those unions, who are pushing for equal pay, who are suing in court and taking those cases to the EEOC. So it is the labor movement that is feeding those movements. And in a similar way, and this is a problem I had with Sue Cottle's book on the other women's movement, when she talked about labor feminism, she didn't talk very much about what women in that movement are doing for women. And it's curious because the 40s and 50s, again, are these periods in which you get the emergence of all these women leaders, and they're not just the handful she picks on, but it's pretty widespread. And they're dealing with different issues, and they're tapping different forms of community organization and different social movements. So it's, and not to use another left cliche, but it's 1,000 flowers that bloom, right? they're everywhere. And it's because women are everywhere, because women's issues are everywhere. And they take a lot of energy from the labor movement. And the labor movement here is not because Walter Reuther decides, it's because Millie Jeffrey decides, and Olga Madar, and people who are a lot lower on the scale in communities and in factories who go up and say, we've got to pursue this issue of equity. And in that sense, there's a lot of reciprocity moving back and forth between those movements. But the labor movement itself in the 60s and 70s it's like the whole leadership is turned over here dealing with the dissidents and doing, service for their membership. And over here, all the people going, look what we got, look at the resources we got. Let's go fund, a conference to talk about the founding of a new student left. Let's take these things and go out and organize in the community. Let's take these resources in the legal department and pursue equality cases on the basis of race and gender. And in that sense, it's a perfect example of what you're talking about. The reciprocity, but also how even within an institutionalized movement, it's almost like there are pockets where social movements continue to survive. And that activism never entirely goes away, but can be tapped at points of crisis, but maybe also points of opportunity.
So, I think one of the areas of resurgence in the labor movement today are the teachers' unions, the nurses' unions, the AFSCME government workers. What lessons or parallels would you see that we should be paying attention with the current resurgence of the labor movement?
I think it's really interesting. I'm working on a piece, and I sent it off today, and quavering at how bad or good it is. But I talk a little bit about in this, and I think I actually took that paragraph out, about how the teachers' unions are really that the current activism seems to be propelled by, motivated by things that look very much like the 30s. The politics of austerity that led to the laying off of 100,000 teachers in 2009-2010. The politics of austerity that has for decades led teachers to buy student supplies because the schools don't have them. Sometimes textbooks, the politics of austerity that has led to overcrowded classrooms and the consequences of that austerity, which is subpar learning environments, even when you have dedicated teachers, a lot of problems with teacher retention because people get burned out in those environments. And I think also, and this is a separate topic, but the response is also to school violence as part of this crisis in public education. And I think in a similar way, nurses have had to come to terms with both an economic environment that tremendously undercuts their ability to do their job. And for professionals, and for people with missions like nurses and teachers and even people who just take their work seriously, but those are the groups that you mentioned. It's enormously difficult if there are only 2 nurses on a ward with 40 patients. I mean, how do you do your job? How do you make sure that medical mistakes are not made? And here again, I've been thinking a lot about, because I've written on and hope to write a little bit more on the response of nurses to the AIDS crisis and to the discovery of bloodborne pathogens and their activism around the Needle Stick Prevention and Safety Act, which I think is the origins of the current activism, which moves from what's in my environment to how these hospitals, these services, these drug companies are not serving us as a community. And that they, like teachers, are uniquely positioned, socially and strategically positioned to be the voice of those communities, to be advocates. And how that is both a complete fulfilling of their mission, but also in some ways a break from their notion of themselves as detached professionals who are not going to get involved. And both of those groups have been charged and motivated by these crises that are partly economic and partly to do with the consequences of those changing economics. Yeah.
Thank you for covering the national history and some local history of women and labor movement. But are you familiar with one of our local heroes here, Millie Johnson?
I am, but not in any depth. I know who she is and how important and influential she was.
I'm glad that she's nationally, especially you're from the Detroit area.
Well, I've been living there. I'm not
So
so from
you're,
there.
big bastion of unionism. And, we got to know, like in a microcosm, about some of the things that you're talking about.
Mhm.
Works that feature Millie Johnson, and I happen to know her. She did into her 90s. Well, she's not now, but I used to ride with her to meetings and on the bus because she took the city bus. But,
Yeah.
she was with the hotel.
Oh, yeah.
workers, and,
Yeah.
so all the things that you're saying.
I think they apply to her. She's a good example.
It's a privilege to hear what you're saying, and to have known a person that lived through the 30s and 40s and 50s, 60s, 70s. So,
Thank you.